Hello everyone. Our discussion for today is all about victimology. So by the end of this topic, you learners could be able to comprehend the origin of victimology, contrast the models, concepts, and theories relevant to victimology, identify the different kinds of victims and their common reactions caused by victimization, and recognize, explain, and apply the rights of crime victim in accordance to international and Philippine laws. So first, we will define what is victimology. So victimology is the scientific study of the psychological effects of crime and the relationship between victims and offender. This is the scientific study of victimization, including the relationships between victims and offenders, and the interactions between victims and the criminal justice system, and the connections between victims and other societal groups and institutions, such as the media, businesses, and social movements. So victimology examines victim patterns and tendencies, studies how victims interact with the police and the legal system, and analyzes how factors of class, race, and sexual orientation affect the perception of the victim by different constituents, including the public, the court, system, and the media. So, now who is a crime victim? So generally, it refers to any person, group, or entity who has suffered injury or loss due to illegal activity. So legally, victim typically includes the following: a person who has suffered direct or threatened physical, emotional, or pecuniary harm as a result of the commission of a crime, or in the case of a victim being an institutional entity, any of the same harms by an individual or authorized representative of another entity. So, crime victims are persons who were injured and killed, may it be accidentally or intentionally. So, it could also be an institutional entity. So, institutional entity refers to an institution of higher education, a public school district, a local government, a municipal utility, or a designee of one of those entities mentioned. Now, let's proceed to the brief history of victimology. So the scientific study of victimology can be traced back to the 1940s and 1950s. So two criminologists, Benjamin Mendelssohn and Hans von Hentig, began to explore the field of victimology by creating typologies. So they are considered as the fathers of the study of victimology. So Mendelssohn was the first to coin the term victimology in 1940. So victimology versus criminology. Let's distinguish between the two. So victimology focuses on helping victims heal after the crime, while criminology aims to understand the criminal's motives and conceivable aspect of deviant behavior. So victimology or criminologists look at every conceivable aspect of deviant behavior. So this includes the impacts of crime on individual victims and their families, society at large, and even criminals themselves, according to the balance. So criminologists study elements like the frequency, location, causes, and types of crime, then work to develop effective and humane means of preventing it. So, victimologists are concerned with fostering recovery, while criminologists seek prevention. So, criminologists seek to understand the social impact of the crime. Now let's proceed with victimity and victimizer. So, victimity refers to the state, quality, or fact of being a victim, while victimizer refers to a person who victimizes others. So victimity explains how and why did the victim became a victim through looking at the victim's or the person's characteristics and behavior which affect his or her risk of becoming a crime victim. While victimizer are those persons who does harm to others. Now let's proceed to the theories of victimization. So let's tackle first the first generation of early victimologists. So first is Hans von Hentig. So he developed a typology of victims based on the degree to which victims contributed to causing the criminal act. He classified victims into 13 categories depending on their propensity or risk of victimization. So we have the young, female, old, immigrants, depressed, wanton, tormentor, black, exempted, or fighting. So according to Hans von Hentig, so his notion that victims contributed to their victimization through their actions and behaviors led to the development of the concept of victim blaming and is seen by many victim advocates as an attempt to assign equal culpability to the victim. So next is Benjamin Mendelssohn. So he is an attorney referred to as the father of victimology. Developed six-category typology of victims based on legal considerations of the degree of a victim's culpability. Okay, so Benjamin Mendelssohn, um, he was intrigued by the dynamics that take place between victims and offenders, so he surveyed both parties during the course of preparing a case for trial. So using those data, he developed a six-category of typology of victims based on legal considerations of the degree of a victim's culpability. So, this classification range from the completely innocent victim, for example, a child or a completely unconscious person, to the imaginary victim or those persons suffering from mental disorders who believe they are victim. So next is Marvin E. Wolfgang. So the first empirical evidence to support the notion that victims are to some degree responsible for their own victimization. He identified three factors common to victim-precipitated homicides. So the victim first is that the victim, an offender, had some prior interpersonal relationship. So for example, the victim and the offender met through online dating websites and decided to meet up. But then by the moment they met, the woman was killed because the other person was a psychopath or a serial killer preying through online dating apps or websites. So also, another factor is that there was a series of escalating disagreements between parties. So for example, a series of heated arguments. So the suspect couldn't keep his cool and was able to shoot the victim. And then next is the victim had consumed alcohol. So for example, especially on women who were taken advantage of because they're drunk. So next is Stephen Schaffer. So his typology classifies victims on the basis of their functional responsibility. So Schaffer's seven-category functional responsibility typology range from the no victim responsibility, for example, unrelated victims, those who are biologically weak, to some degree of victim responsibility, for example, precipitative victims, the total victim responsibility, or self-victimizing. So his typology places victims in groups based on how responsible they are for their own victimization. So next is Menachem Amir. So he undertook one of the first studies of rape. He reported that 19% of all forcible rapes were victim precipitated by such factors as the use of alcohol by both parties, seductive actions by the victim, victims wearing of revealing clothing, which could tantalize the offender to the point of misreading the victim's behavior. So he reported that or his work rather, was criticized by the victims movement and the feminist movement as blaming the victim. So let's proceed to the second generation or the theories of victimization. So first is the lifestyle exposure theory. So posits that persons with certain demographic profiles are more prone to experience criminal victimization because they're likely to or their lifestyles expose risky situations. So it is developed in 1978 by Michael Hendelang, Michael Gottfredson, and James Garofalo when they published a book titled Victims of Personal Crime, an empirical foundation for a theory of personal victimization. So, according to this theory, for instance, one's sex carries with it certain role expectations and societal constraints. So it is how the individual reacts to these influences that determine one's lifestyle. So if females spend more time at home, so they would be exposed to fewer risky situations involving strangers and hence experience fewer stranger committed victimizations. So next theory is the routine activities theory. So it is based on the assumption that crime can be committed by anyone who has the opportunity. So the theory also states that victims are given choices on whether to be victims mainly by not placing themselves in situations where a crime can be committed against them. So it was first proposed by Marcus Felson and Lawrence E. Cohen in their explanation of crime rate changes in the United States between 1947 and 1974. So, for example, according to this theory, if someone spends time in public places such as bars or hanging out on the streets, he or she increases the likelihood of coming into contact with a motivated offender in the absence of a capable guardian. So, the supply of motivated offenders is taken as a given. So what varies is the supply of suitable targets. So for example, lightweight, easy to conceal properties such as cell phones and DVD players or drunk individuals. And capable guardians, so for example, neighbors, police, and burglar alarms. So another theories of victimization. So first is Luckinbill's 1977 situated transaction model. So the idea is that an interpersonal level crime and victimization is a contest of character. So the stages go like this. So first is insult. So then is clarification, retaliation, counter-retaliation, presence of weapon, and then onlookers. So in the insult, for example, he will say, your mama, or sa Bisaya pa, imong mama. And then the other person will respond, what do you say about my mother? And then retaliation. So he would repeat, I said your mama and you too. So, and then the other person will counter. So, well, you're worse than my mama. So, then that other person naman, the one who insulted first, he will search for a weapon or he will clench his fist. And then the onlookers, so usually when there are onlookers, so they would escalate the situations because namagoy uban nga ma-motivate or mas ma-aggressive sila kung naay maglantaw nga lain nga mga tao. So next is Benjamin and Master's threefold model. So this one is found in a variety of criminological studies, from prison riots to strain theories. So the idea is that conditions that support crime can be classified into three general categories. So first is the precipitating factors. So we have time, space, being in the wrong situation at the wrong time. And then attracting factors, so choices, options, lifestyles. The sociological expression lifestyle refers to daily routine activities as well as special events one engages in or on a predictable basis. And then we have predisposing factors. All the socio-demographic characteristics of victims, being male, being young, being poor, being a minority, living in squalor, being single, or being unemployed. So next theory is Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felson's routine activities theory. So crime occurs whenever three conditions come together according to this theory. So first is suitable targets. So we'll always have suitable targets as long as we have poverty. So usually because of poverty, mas mataas ang crime rate. And then we also have motivated offenders. So we'll always have motivated offenders since victimology, unlike deterministic criminology, assumes anyone will try to get away with something if they can. So usually, naiuban, motivate sila nga muhimo og crime because they think that they can easily get away with the uh, offense or the crime that they have committed. And then absence of guardians. So the problem is that there's few defensible spaces, so natural surveillance areas, and in the absence of private security, the government can't do the job alone. And the next is the victim precipitation theory. So it was first promulgated by von Hentig in 1941 and applies only to violent victimization. So its basic premise is that by acting in certain provocative ways, some individuals initiate a chain of events that lead to their victimization. So um, also this theory suggests that some people may actually initiate the confrontation that eventually leads to injury or death. So victim precipitation can be either active or passive. So we have active precipitation. So it occurs when victims act provocatively, so use threats or fighting words or even attack first. So sila mismo ang nag-provoke sa suspect mo na nga nahimo silang biktima. So ilahang sungog, ilahang provoke ug ayo to the point nga na-threaten ng suspect so that um, at the end or ang nahitabo is that ni fight back ang suspect. And then we have passive precipitation. So it occurs when the victim exhibits some personal characteristic that unknowingly either threatens or encourages the attacker. So the crime can occur because of personal conflict. So this may also occur when the victim belongs to a group whose mere presence threatens the attacker's reputation, status, or economic well-being. So next is lifestyle theory. So the basis of this theory is that crime is not a random occurrence, but rather a function of victims' lifestyle. So according to this theory, people who have high-risk lifestyles are drinking, taking drugs, getting involved in crime, maintain a much greater chance of victimization. So we have here the equivalent group hypothesis. So according to this, victims and criminals share similar characteristics because they are not actually separate groups. And a criminal lifestyle exposes people to increased levels of victimization risk. And then we have the proximity hypothesis. Some people willingly put themselves in jeopardy by choosing high-risk lifestyles or because they are forced to live in close physical proximity to the criminals. So they are in the wrong place and the wrong time. And the next is the deviant place hypothesis. So there are natural areas for crime. For example, poor, densely populated, highly transient neighborhoods in which commercial and residential property exists side by side. So next is the deviant place theory. So it states that an individual is more likely to become the victim of a crime when exposed to dangerous areas. So according to deviant place theory, victims do not encourage crime but are victim prone because they reside in socially disorganized high crime areas where they have the great risk of coming into contact with criminal offenders, irrespective of their own behavior or lifestyle. So deviant places are poor, densely populated, and highly transient neighborhoods in which commercial and residential property exists side by side. So now let's proceed to victim and victimization. So who are victims? So in general means persons who, by reason of natural disaster or man-made cause, individually or collectively have suffered harm, including physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, economic loss, or substantial impairment of their fundamental rights through acts or omissions that are in violation of criminal laws operative with member states, including those laws prescribing criminal abuse of power. So, in country, it refers to a person who sustains injury or damage as a result of the commission of a crime. So, the impact of crime on an individual victim, their loved ones, and their community depends on a variety of factors. But often, crime victimization has significant emotional, psychological, physical, financial, and social consequences. So here are the effects and consequences of victimization. So we have physical consequences. So these are often visible and range in seriousness from bruises and scrapes to broken bones to fatal injuries. So the physical impact on victims of some crime types are at greater risk of being affected physically by the crime. So victims of violent crimes may be left with a chronic physical condition or even a disability. So also other less foreseeable injuries such as threat of sexually transmitted disease, especially those victims of sexual assault or sex crimes, can also be a result of a victimization incident. So next is the psychological or emotional and mental consequences. So emotional, psychological, and mental consequences of victimization may be less externally obvious but are just as serious as physical injury. So stress, depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders are but a few that crime victims experience. So next is financial consequences. So the monetary costs of victimization to the victim are at times easy to calculate and at other times impossible to measure. So medical expenses, property losses, lost wages, and legal costs are financial consequences that victims and their family must bear. So according to research studies, they found out that older victims feel distress about losing their children's inheritance and being unable to financially support themselves. For some victims, the financial loss was so severe that they became bankrupt, were made homeless, had to sell their home or business, had to postpone retirement or return to work after retiring, or had to move in with their family members, and etc. So, trauma and victimization. So, first is primary injuries. So, primary injuries includes physical trauma, intense stress reactions, and emotional trauma. So, physical trauma, this is a serious injury or shock to the body as from a major accident. So, victims may have cuts, bruises, fractured arms or legs, or internal injuries. And then we have intense stress reactions. So victims' breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate may increase and their muscles may tighten. So they may feel exhausted but unable to sleep, and they may have headaches, increased or decreased appetites, or digestive problems. So next is emotional trauma. So victims may experience emotional trauma, emotional wounds, or shocks that may have long-lasting effects. So emotional trauma may take many different forms. So first is shock or numbness. So this is when the victims may feel frozen and cut off from their own emotions. So some victims say they feel as if they're watching a movie rather than having their own experience. So they may not be able to make decisions or conduct their lives as they did before the crime. Then we have denial, disbelief, and anger. So usually victims may experience this so-called denial and an unconscious defense against painful or unbearable memories and feelings about the crime. Or they may just experience disbelief, telling themselves this just could not have happened to me, and they may feel intense anger and a desire to get even with the offender. So they have this feeling that they want to seek revenge or they want to avenge themselves. And the next is acute stress disorder. So some crime victims may experience trouble sleeping, flashbacks, extreme tension or anxiety, outbursts of anger, memory problems, trouble concentrating, and other symptoms of distress for days or weeks following a trauma. So next is secondary injuries. So when victims do not receive the support and help they need after the crime, they may suffer secondary injuries. So they may um, be hurt by a lack of understanding from friends, family, the um, and the professionals they come into contact with, particularly if others seem to blame the victim for the crime, suggesting they should have been able to prevent or avoid it. So next is common injuries. So this includes bruises, cuts, scrapes, broken bones, sexually transmitted diseases, and a wide range of internal injuries. So next are the stages of trauma recovery. So the first stage is silence. So this is the initial stage following a traumatic event and is often a time of silence for the victim. So it's common for recently victimized people to refuse talk or to talk about what happened. So this may be due to a number of things including stigma, isolation, shame, guilt, confusion, or denial about the event. So a person emerging from trauma may have low self-esteem at first and may feel overwhelmed and disconnected from the rest of the world. Next is victimhood. So eventually, the traumatized self may start to look for change as the ongoing suffering interferes with daily life tasks and the need to grow and recover begins to form. So the person now, they may feel compelled to talk openly with everyone about what happened and the suffering he or she experienced. So some people will likely be more willing than others to listen. For people working their way through the stage of victimization, having someone to listen and support them as they process the event can be critical to their ability to move forward into survivorhood. So next stage is survivorhood. So once a person processes the traumatic event and continues transitioning away from the victim experience, he or she often begins identifying as a survivor. So during this stage, a person has had an opportunity to talk about his or her experience and has gained um, some sense of clarity. So he or she may begin to identify the ways in which he or she persevered and the strengths that help make moving forward possible. So the person hasn't forgotten the event, of course, but he or she has a greater understanding about what the event means and the impact it has made on his or her life. So next stage is thriving and transcendence. So most people um, seem content reaching the stage of survivorhood. So they feel like they are managing challenges better and have a greater awareness about themselves and their experiences. So other people, the person hasn't forgotten the event, but he or she has a greater understanding about what the event means and the impact it has made on his or her life. However, um, some people um, tell or told that they're not done growing. Some of them have even said that they do not want to be called a survivor. So next are the models of victimization. So first model is the victim of crime model, man-made cause. So this is applicable to victims of man-made causes like homicide, rape, and others. So the stages are as follows. So stage of impact and disorganization. So this depicts the attitude or activity of the victim during and immediately following the criminal event. So next is the stage of recoil. So occurs during which the victim formulates psychological defenses and deals with conflicting emotions of guilt, anger, acceptance, and desire of revenge. So this could last 3 to 8 months. And then next is the reorganization stage. So this stage occurs during which the victim puts his or her life back to normal daily living. So next model is the victim of disaster model. So this is by or through natural cause. So this is applicable to victims of natural causes like earthquake, flood, volcanic eruption, and others. So the stages are as follows. So we have the pre-impact stage. So this describes the state of the victim prior to being victimized. And then we have impact stage. This stage is the phase in which victimization occurs. Next is post-impact stage. So this stage entails the degree and duration of the personal and social disorganization following victimization. And then we have behavioral outcome. So this phase describes the victim's adjustment to the victimization experience. Then we also have kinds of crime victim. So direct or primary crime victim. So this kind of victim directly suffers the harm or injury, which is physical, psychological, and economic losses. So he is the main victim of the crime. And then we have the indirect or secondary crime victim. So these are victims who experience the harm secondhand. So this may include family members of the primary victims. So next is the tertiary crime victim. So victims who experience the harm vicariously, such as through media accounts, the scared public or community due to watching news regarding crime incidents. So for example, for a crime of rape, so um, when it will become viral, so we people who will witness or who can view the news or who can watch the news. So makafeel pud ta nga mura pud ta og biktima. So kita nga dili kaano-ano sa victim, we will be considered as the tertiary crime victim. So next is the typology of victims. So first is Mendelssohn's types of victim. So Mendelssohn interviewed victims to obtain information, and his analysis led him to believe that most victims had an unconscious aptitude for being victimized. So these are as follows. So we have the innocent, so portrayed as just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then we have victim with only minor guilt and was victimized due to ignorance. So he or she wasn't aware that who he's dealing with is already a perpetrator. And then next is victim who is just as guilty as the offender and the voluntary victim. So suicide case is common of this category. And then we have the victim guiltier than the offender, to describe as containing persons who provoke the criminal or actively induce their own victimization. So they were the reason why such person became the offender, because they're the ones who provoke, they're the ones who said hurtful and provoking words. That is why the offender was kanang kuan nawad-an siya og patience, um, and then um, naka-inflict siya og harm sa said victim. And then we have the most guilty victim who is guilty alone. So this is an attacker killed by a would-be victim in the act of defending themselves is an example of this. So for example, ako gidepensahan ako akong kaugalingon kay naay kawatan. So katong kawatan ako siyang napatay. So katong nga kawatan mo to siya ma-considered as the most guilty victim. And then we have the imaginary victim. So this is a victim suffering from mental disorders or those victims with extreme mental abnormalities. So according to Mendelssohn, the last five types all contributed somehow to their own injury and represented as victim precipitation. And then we have Hans von Hentig's taxonomy of murder victims. So we have the depressive type. So this lacks ordinary prudence and discretion. So it is an easy target, careless, and unsuspecting. So they are submissive by virtue of emotional condition. And the next is greedy of gain or acquisitive type. So a victim who lacks all normal inhibitions and well-founded suspicions. So this victim is easily duped because his or her motivation for easy gain lowers his or her natural tendency to be suspicious. For example, those persons who wants easy money. And then here comes the time nga naka-encounter siya message saying that he will be um, or he will gain 3,000 pesos per day just by. So next is the greedy of gain or acquisitive type. So this is a victim who lacks all normal inhibitions and well-founded suspicions. So this victim is easily duped because his or her motivation for easy gain lowers his or her natural tendency to be suspicious. So for example, those persons who wants easy money. So nakabasa og message that he will be paid 3,000 per day if he will do this job. And then an ending, by the time he clicked that link, so it was a some kind of scam, and then hurot ang sulod sa iyahang bank account or sa iyahang GCash. And the next is the wanton or overly sensual type. So they were particularly vulnerable to stresses that occur at a given period of time in a life cycle, such as juvenile crimes. So further, this victim is ruled by passion and thoughtlessly seeking pleasure. And then we have the tormentor type, the victim of attack from the target of his or her abuse, such as with battered women. So the most primitive way of solving a personal conflict is to annihilate physically the cause of the trouble. And then we have the lonesome type. So this is the same with the acquisitive type of victim by virtue of wanting companionship or affection. So for example, those persons nga moadto og bar kay gusto sila na makainom. So ang ending gi-drug ang ilahang ilimnon, then especially babayi dayon mo to nahimo siyang victim og rape. And then we have the heartbroken type, emotionally disturbed by virtue of heartaches and pains. So, heartbroken, nag-inom-inom, so mo na nga ang ending, dito sa bar, nakakita og away, kinilaging heartbroken, nagmaoy, so napusilan, nakulatahan. And the next is von Hentig's classes of victim. So we have the young, so weak by virtue of age and immaturity. So for example, kanang mga bata or those persons nga kanang kuan kanang mga batanon. And then we also have the female, physically less powerful and is easily dominated by male. Kay syempre kasagara basta babayi, dili gyud siya as physically powerful compare sa lalaki. And then we have the old, incapable of physical defense and the common object of illegal shame. So, kasagara ang biktima ho na ng mga scam kay kaning mga tiguwang. Especially if dili pa sila kabalo sa pasikot-sikot sa mga social media, sa internet, sa mga gadgets, mo nga dali ra sila mabiktima. And then we have the mentally defective, so unable to think clearly, kanang mga naay mga problema sa mental health. So dali ra sila ma-manipulate. And then we have the immigrant, unsure of the rules of conduct in the surrounding society. Manang kasagara sa mga immigrants, mabiktima og mga kawat-kawat. And then napuy uban nga mabiktima og mga kanang scam. And then we also have the minorities. So racial prejudice may lead to victimization for unequal treatment by the agency of justice. So kani karon uso na ni siya. We have this so-called hate crime, especially in US. So daghanang mga Asians nga na biktima because they hate Asians kay according to them, they were the carrier of the COVID-19 virus man na nga usually sa uban dito ron delikado kay kinayuman mo kalitlag pangulata and then walay reason. So ang reason di ay katurang naglagot sila sa mga Asians. So now let's proceed to the overview of victims' rights. So these are the below is the list of basic victims' rights provided by law in most jurisdictions. So these rights vary depending on federal, state, or tribal law. So first is the right to be treated with dignity, respect, and sensitivity. So victims generally have the right to be treated with courtesy, fairness, and care by law enforcement and other officials throughout the entire criminal justice process. So this right is included in the constitutions of most states that have victims' rights amendments and in the statutes of more than half of the states. So next is right to be informed. So the purpose of this right is to make sure that victims have the information they need to exercise their rights and to seek services and resources that are available to them. So next is right to protection. So in many states, victims have the right to protection from threats, intimidation, or retaliation during criminal proceedings. So depending on the jurisdiction, victims may receive the following types of protection. So we have the police escorts, witness protection programs, relocation, and restraining orders. So next is right to apply for compensation. So the purpose of compensation is to recognize victims' financial losses and to help them recover some of these costs. So compensating programs or compensation programs seldom cover property loss or pain and suffering. Also, victim compensation is a prayer of last resort. Compensation programs will not cover expenses that can be paid by some other programs such as health insurance or workman's compensation. And then right to restitution from the offender. So the purpose of this right is to hold offenders directly responsible to victims for the financial harm they cause. So the court orders the offender to pay a specific amount of restitution, either a lump sum or a series of payments. So some types of losses covered by restitution include lost wages, property loss, and insurance deductibles. And then we have right to prompt return of personal property. So crime investigators must often seize some of the victim's property as evidence for a criminal case. So To speed up the return of the property, some states allow law enforcement to use photographs of the item rather than the item itself as evidence. So the prompt return of personal property reduces inconvenience to victims and helps restore their sense of security. And then right to speedy trial. So dapat nga mas quick or mas ma-quicken ang trial. And then we have right to enforcement of victims' rights. So states or other states have laws that permit victims to assert their rights in court. So to be meaningful, legal rights must be enforced. So next is the United Nations Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. So we have access to justice and fair treatment. So victims should be treated with compassion and respect for their dignity. So they are entitled to access the mechanisms of justice and to prompt redress as provided for by national legislation for the harm they have suffered. And then next is restitution. So offenders or third parties responsible for their behavior should, where appropriate, make fair restitution to victims, their families, or their dependents. So such restitution should include the return of property or repayment for the harm or loss suffered, reimbursement of expenses incurred as a result of the victimization, and the provision of services and the restoration of rights. And then we have compensation. So, when compensation is not fully available from the offender or other sources, states should endeavor to provide financial compensation to the victims who have sustained significant bodily injury or impairment of physical or mental health as a result of the commission of the serious crime. So, the family in particular, dependents of persons who have died or become physically or mentally incapacitated as a result of such victimization. And the next is assistance. So victims should receive the necessary trial or necessary material, medical, psychological, and social assistance through governmental, voluntary, community-based, and indigenous means. So victims should be informed of the availability of health and social services and other relevant assistance and be readily afforded access to them. And also, police, justice, health, social service, and other personal concerned should be or should receive training to sensitize them to the needs of victims and guidelines to ensure proper and prompt aid. So, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned something about victimology. That's all, and God bless you.